LiSTNR production.
A suspicious fire in a small shopping centre business district. A suspect who has an alibi. And a small Australian town begging detectives to find the arsonist. In this episode, the importance of digital evidence, the dynamics of suspect interviews, and the steps involved to prove arson. Graeme Simpfendorfer is a former Victorian detective with more than 25 years of experience, including leading teams of detectives in the Homicide Squad and working on some of the state's most complex investigations. Sometimes it's simple day-to-day policing that puts offenders before the courts. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
That was a really intriguing case on a number of levels, both because of the impact it had on the community. You know, it was a central business district area. The premises had a roof line that covered, I think, about 12 businesses that were affected by this fire. And it was overnight, I think it was overnight on a Sunday night from memory, because I started work on the Monday. It was my first day back from leave after a significant amount of time off. And, you know, you do your usual check 1,000 emails and wonder what's going on for the day, but realised the team were out at a crime scene that morning of a fire. And I remember touching base with them, and they told me that, you know, nothing much to do with this one, boss. This one looks like it's an electrical fault, not much to see or do here, and got on with the day as usual. But got to a couple of hours into the shift and realised I hadn't heard from the team and touched base with them again, and things weren't quite adding up the way they'd hoped down at the scene. So I decided to join them, which was only 2 blocks in Wodonga to the main street from the cop shop. And pretty much straight away I could just have the look of the front door to what was an electrical room that was almost in the centre of the commercial premises that housed these 12 businesses. And that front door was affected by fire, as was the cafe next to it. So directly next to the electrical room was the cafe, and both were reasonably damaged by fire. What probably helped us in that scene was an ambulance returning from a job. I think it was early hours of the morning, like 3 a.m. around that time. An ambulance returning from a job had seen smoke coming out of the roof of the commercial structure and called the fire rescue team, and they were able to extinguish the fire relatively early in the stages of the fire. So that did help us with our scene somewhat, and that proved critical as time went on. Now, we had a look at the scene there, and it was set up, to me it looked like it was set up to be an electrical fire. That's what whoever set this fire wanted us to believe and wanted us to write it off as an electrical fault. But it was quite clear to us and the fire investigators from Fire Rescue that the damage to the electrical room was not from the electrical switchboard. That was quite clear. We really then focused in on the who or what or why would cause this fire. Now, as I said, there was 12 other businesses affected by that roof line, but significantly the cafe next to the electrical room was the most severely damaged. And we had a look at the cafe. What stood out most to us that had a look in that cafe was, as I said, it was a Sunday night into Monday morning, and it was very clear to us that cafe was not ready to trade on the Monday morning. A lot of stock had been cleared out. The refrigerator room did not have stock in it, was missing a lot of significant items, coffee and stuff to make sandwiches, all usual cafe stuff was gone. And when we interviewed the owner, he was very adamant that no, the business was going to open, everything was fine. He'd just done the shopping for the morning and was ready to open up trade, and the fire was an absolute shock to him. But look, I'll be honest, right away we were narrowed in on the owner just from that reaction of, it was a bit of crocodile tears and a little bit of the investigative spider senses were tingling for us, as you would well know. So we narrowed in on the owner, but we had no real cause to suspect him other than things weren't adding up. So number one, we needed to prove that fire was suspicious. So a significant amount of work at the scene, making sure that it was not electrical. So we got electrical experts in from Melbourne to show that it was not an electrical fire, and we're able to then ascertain by scraping away. You can imagine the amount of damage from the roof line and everything that had fallen down to the floor, that once we scraped all that back, we could actually see what were traces of accelerant on the concrete floor of the electrical room and in parts of the cafe. So for us, it was definitely arson, and that really opened up the investigation for us as to, we knew that the how, we knew that it was started by deliberate means, but then we've got to focus on the why, which would hopefully look at who the suspects were going to be if we could establish the why. So it took us a while to get to that phase, and the city areas generally have a lot of CCTV, not so much in the country areas. We're still trying to play catch up. So we decided to have a look for some CCTV around the area, and we hit a bit of gold. One of the neighbouring cafes that were one of the 12 that had that roof line, they had CCTV, and that was a hairdresser's, and that had CCTV and did show what we believe to be a male dressed up in a hoodie and dark clothing and wandering down a laneway in the early hours, only about 20 minutes before the fire started. So we believe that was our suspect. That was definitely out of the ordinary. And reviewing the footage, we were able to see that whoever that was sort of hiding their face from the camera as they walked down the laneway. So they knew the camera was there. They were trying to avoid it. So we thought, this is someone that's familiar with the area. So again, we were thinking, well, it probably could be the owner, or it could be random, but keeping an open mind. So we had to go to work on that footage. It wasn't the best. It was grainy. At best, we could probably say it was male. That was about as good as we could get just from the build of the person. We had to put a lot of work into that scene, hours and hours. I think we were there for almost 2 days assessing that scene to determine the cause and area of origin of that fire. And the area of origin was in the electrical room, but the cause was by deliberate means, so direct source ignition on the available material there. There was a fair bit of cardboard and clothing and other material in that electrical room that we say started the fire. It's just a matter of then trying to work out the why of the fire. And as we know, fire can be determined for many reasons as to why, from either a financial gain or to cover up another crime or revenge. It could be anything. So we're thinking ahead to hopefully we can solve this, but we would need to show to a court or a jury exactly why or what was the purpose of this fire and the intent of the fire. So keeping an open mind on that, we reviewed hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage around the city of Wodonga. I think we collected just about every bit of footage we could from the CBD, so hundreds of hours of footage. And other than that one bit of CCTV I mentioned from the hairdressers next door, we did not get one other sighting of this person on footage anywhere in the city. So that told us a really important thing. I know the team was pretty devastated we didn't get anything, but we sort of shifted our mind to, well, even though it doesn't show something, it actually tells us that that person may have planned their route to the premises and were well aware of where the cameras were. So we started to look on where the gaps were. So we mapped out the city. We looked at everywhere where the footage was, and there was just this almost a very obvious route or lane of where the person could have gone out of camera. And there was only one laneway that was possible for them to access outside the cameras of the city. And that was towards the southwest of the city, and ironically enough, the direction of where the owner lived. So more and more we were starting to focus in on the owner and what was his whereabouts on the night and what was his alibi. So it was a real intense start to that investigation and limited resources. I think to start there was 2 of us working on that for about 3 or 4 days, and all the other crime in the city doesn't stop, so we're still managing everything else that comes in. But as you can imagine, a significant fire in the middle of town, media all across it. We're playing a little bit coy with what we think is going on because we only get one chance of releasing information to the media for a public appeal. We don't want misinformation out there. So we're trying to be quite tactical with that. And eventually we had to go to the media to try and see if we could stir up some other witnesses that may have seen this person in the early hours of the morning. But again, unlike the city, not everyone's out and about at 3 or 4 in the morning around Wodonga. Most people are tucked up in bed. So we did not get anything out of a public appeal. So eventually we had to think of what we were going to do next, and at some point we had to go and speak to the owner, and we got a statement from the owner and his partner as to what their whereabouts were on the night. And he was very adamant that he was tucked up in bed with his partner, and she made exactly the same statement to us, that they were both in bed all night, don't know anything about the fire, went to bed after watching some sport on TV, fell asleep together, woke up together, come down to the business and saw that a crime had been committed. So that was not unexpected, but was challenging that he now has an alibi, and a pretty solid one, that his partner's saying he never left bed and he never left the house. And she was very believable. He wasn't quite so believable, but she was very believable. So we're a little bit in two minds then, thinking, have we got the right guy? Have we not? Are we focusing on the right direction? We must keep an open mind here at all times as to who we're focusing on. But everything we were looking at just kept coming back to the owner. And by that I mean we looked at all the financials of the 12 businesses. When we spoke to the owner of the whole premises, how's everyone going with their rent? How's everyone going with their bills? Every business was okay except one, except the cafe. They were well behind in their rent. Everywhere we turned to, they were in debt. They owed the coffee merchants that supplied coffee. They owed the milkmen. They owed everyone. So they were in a bit of trouble financially. And again, that stood out to us. But yet we had this overwhelming hurdle for the investigation that he had a pretty rock-solid alibi. I was home in bed with his partner. I think what looking back, definitely what stood out to me again was when I spoke to all the other businesses around the impact and how they were going and their welfare. Every one of the business owners was, Simph, we hope you catch the bastards. Please do all you can to catch them. And only one person didn't say that. And guess who that was? It was the owner of the cafe. His questions were all around, what do you think? Would you know where it started? And again, we were just really, really focused on him as the suspect, but had this hurdle of an alibi to get past.
So you've established from the scene arson, there's accelerant. You've got a suspect, this chap, but he's got an alibi. You've also got motive, I guess, to a degree with regards to his financial situation. How do you get it over the line? Where's the point where you can turn the key?
We went forensics, obviously, that's always a go-to, but that wasn't giving us anything concrete other than an accelerant was used. There was no other forensic evidence, so no fingerprints, no DNA, there was no clothing left behind. So we had to rely on some old-fashioned policing and just talking to people where they last saw the owner, because we wanted to break down his alibi, although it's a very narrow time frame of I went to bed at 10, 11 o'clock and I woke up at 6 a.m. So how do you knock that alibi out? We decided we'd knock on some of the other doors around the business premises. One in particular, one of the neighbouring businesses, ironically, had been working outside of hours at her business, just serving some other clients really early on the Sunday morning, and it's not a time that she would normally trade, and yet she saw the owner, Rocky, turn up to the premises very early on the Sunday morning, which is out of character, and he was removing some items out of the cafe, so removing a big mirror and removing some other items of value, and she thought that was a bit weird, but didn't think much of it at the time until we prompted her, what was he doing? He was removing them from the premises, not out the front door, by a side door, which again told us, well, he doesn't want to be seen doing this. And for us, it was saying he's getting the most valuable property out before the fire starts. So that painted a little bit of a picture, but didn't break it down his alibi again. Any decent defence barrister's going to laugh that out of court, that he was just moving stuff as part of his business. So eventually we had canvassed all the footage around town. We had exhausted every avenue from the scene and out, and we did not get any other leads. So we decided to go the other end of the investigation, actually look at where he lived and the people around his premises. As I mentioned before, there was a clear gap in the footage on where he could have been, but it was just out of sight of the cameras. So we went the other end of the investigation and looked at his neighbours. And the very first door we knocked on, one of his direct neighbours had cameras, thankfully. More than helpful, and did not know about the fire. We knocked on the door and just asked him about his neighbour, and I know him and he's okay, he's a good fellow, we always talk. And we asked, does he know you've got cameras? And he goes, actually, that's a really funny comment, because he came to me 2 days ago and asked me if my cameras worked. Now this is after the fire, and it was telling us that I think that Rocky had gotten onto the fact that he was number one suspect, and he was very worried about the cameras next door. And he'd actually gone to his neighbour and asked his neighbour to review the footage on what he could see because someone had tried to break into his car. So he came up with a reason why he wanted to look at that footage, and I think in the hope to try and destroy it. But the owner was pretty clued on and said, he'll have a look at it himself, and if he sees something, he'll get back to him. And then the next person that knocks on the door is the police asking to look at the same footage, and lo and behold, at I think it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, we see the vehicle belonging to Rocky exiting his private premises and heading in the direction of the cafe. So we struck gold, and he was now our number one suspect. We still had to prove that he was the one in the car, even though it was his car that left, but his alibi started to break down from there.
Now, there's a point at which you're going to bring him in, you're going to sit him down, and Graeme, you've been around the block a few times. You don't mind when your chief suspect sort of sits down and starts lying and telling stories which you're going to have proof to push back against. Did he end up nodding the head to this? Did he cough to this at some point of the interview? Did you have enough on him that he thought, okay, I'm done here?
Not until the 11th hour at court.
Right.
So in the interview process, definitely not. Yeah, you're right. Eventually we had to bring him in. And I did allude to the fact before that we went to the media and we had a bit of media exposure, and you just refreshed my memory there. He actually rang me one night on my phone. I was at home late one night, and he rang me and he said, I've just seen the news, Graeme, and it doesn't paint me in a very good light, and I'm getting phone calls from members of the public abusing me, and can you do something about it? I said, well, this is not my focus at the moment. I'm focused on the investigation, not the jungle drums of the local people. And he just put it on me. He goes, do you think I lit the fire? So I paused for dramatic effect for about 4 or 5 seconds and just said, yeah, I do. Of course I do. Have I not been clear that I think you're the suspect? And I reminded him that out of everyone that I've spoken to that own businesses in that structure, he is the only one that hasn't wished that I catch the people that did it. And I just let that hang. And I said, I'll see you soon, Rocky. And I think I actually said to him, the next time I see you, I'll be arresting you. Bit of a power play, but I wanted him to know we're onto him. There's no point trying to fight the alibi anymore. And eventually the truth would unravel on him. But what I did not expect was once we got that footage from the neighbour, we had enough to reasonably believe that his alibi had been knocked out. So we had a power of arrest. And we thought, yep, let's go all in here and arrest him formally, put the allegations to him and get him on a recorded interview as to his alibi. I didn't see it coming, and you think you've seen everything in a long time, but when we got him into the interview room and went through all our caution and rights and some of the evidence, and he was quite tight-lipped until he produced his phone, and he goes, you've gone through my phone, you've searched it, and you've listened to it. I said, yeah, and we've looked at some things on your phone. And he goes, well, have you listened to the recording yet that I've got there? I'm like, no, I haven't yet, mate. We'll have a look at it. And what he'd done, he'd actually recorded a conversation that him and his partner had about a week or so earlier. Now, this was a conversation he'd had with his partner around the business and how failing it was, and that they should consider burning it down. Now, what he's done is he's trying to throw his partner under the bus. He's trying to say it's all her idea, that it wasn't him in the car. How can you prove it was me that was there? It was her. She's the one who actually formally owns the business. She's the one in the car. She's trying to set me up, and that he recorded this conversation. Now, we did obviously look at that conversation in depth, and it was a lengthy conversation. Yes, they did discuss around potentially, burning it down, but it was a very fleeting comment by her. You could tell that she did not want part of that conversation. He was driving that, and he was back then, in the week or 10 days leading up to the fire, setting up an alibi for himself. He's trying to set her up. So that was a bit of a shock. We did pause the interview and suspend it. We obviously went straight around to her place and let her in on the giggle and said, you'd never guess what he said. He's actually pointing the finger directly at you. So you can imagine the shock on her face, and she quickly changed tune a little bit to, well, I did go to sleep, but he came to bed after me and I woke up and he was gone. So I actually can't say that he was in bed the whole night. He may have been there, but I'm not 100% certain. But she did point us to some other things in the house that were suspicious. So there was a Gatorade bottle, the very thin Gatorade bottles that we have these days that had petrol in it. That was in the garage that she's never seen before, and that he had burnt some clothes in an outdoor fire pit in the day after the fire, which he thought was obviously strange as well. So we looked at all of that, we collected that, and his alibi really started to break down pretty heavily now that the partner was aware that he was pointing the finger at her, and she just started to tell the truth a bit more around how tight the alibi was. It actually was a bit looser than what she first said, and that he was trying to throw her under the bus. So I guess in answer to your question, yes, he did eventually plead guilty because it was pretty overwhelming, the evidence against him by the end, but that came at the 11th hour, as you know. Once you get that contested hearing out of the way and once you realise there is enough evidence a jury could convict, I think the advice given to him was to plead guilty, and which he did.
That's often the case, isn't it, when the police build up a case as solid as this and there's really no wriggle room in it. You'll often find that the first move there is for the defence counsel of the accused to sort of suggest, look, yeah, you can plead not guilty. That's your entitlement. But when this is all up in front of a jury and I can't see us winning this, and you're going to end up with a more substantial sentence than you would if you'd nod the head to it. So it's interesting what can happen on the steps of the courtroom, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that was the case here. I think once the brief was received by defence, obviously their job is to look for holes in the prosecution case. There was a very significant piece of evidence that was a game changer for us. And one of our investigators, she's very meticulous around devices and phones and everything. She's very tech savvy. I can't say I'm the best at that sort of stuff, but you have a really good team around you. And I remember in the weeks after, I think she came to me and says, "Simph, you'll never guess what I found on his phone." And I mentioned before about how we had this gap in the footage. But what he'd done on his phone, he'd actually left his location services on his phone. So his phone was tracking his every step. So his phone actually mapped out exactly the route he took from home to work. So he'd actually checked himself, or his iPhone had checked himself in at work at the time of the fire. And that was embedded within the software or one of the apps on the Find My iPhone. So it was a pretty tight case in the end, and once he was presented with all that evidence, including that he'd left his location services on and put himself at the fire by mistake, it was pretty overwhelming and probably had no option other than to plead guilty.
That digital footprint that people leave is often added with other evidence, often enough to turn the key, isn't it? It's yeah.
Oh yeah, so much. And even if he had turned his phone off, that becomes evidence in itself. So even if he'd turned his phone off for the time of this duration, we would look at, okay, this is the only time in 6 or 12 months that he's turned his phone off, and that then gets presented to the jury because it's all about credibility of the witness, as we know. So, look, a digital footprint is a massive part of any investigation these days, and juries love to see that evidence. But again, you're learning all the time, and I guess as investigators, we're learning on the run as well about what's available within these phones and within the data that's there.
His partner initially threw up a false alibi for him, claiming that he was in bed, he was asleep all night. Now that in itself leads to police having to do a lot of groundwork to try and sort of deal with that. She turned the corner a bit when she discovered that he was now pointing the finger at her, and now she was sort of under the pump. I guess, had she not been as forthcoming as she was, and she was forthcoming because perhaps her allegiances to him had fallen by the wayside, you'd have been looking close at charging her, I guess, with something at some point, accessory after the fact, or, how close was she to something like that?
Yeah, really fine line, Brent. We did actually get advice from the public prosecutor's office as to her culpability, but based on the phone call that was recorded by Rocky and I guess her statements, both the initial statement and the secondary statement, we did not think there was enough there to run a case of accessory after or actually a principal offender based on what she did. So that was knocked on the head. But I'm of the firm belief that she had no idea. Yes, she knew they were in trouble. He actually ran everything for the business, even though it was in her name, because he did have a failed previous business. So everything pointed to him, and even his financials started to break down. He was lying to the banks, and we're able to prove that as well. He was making up false documents to try and keep the creditors off his back. So it was just unravelling, and I think the lies eventually caught up with him, but he'd been lying for so long, I think he'd even started to believe his own lies, and it took something very significant to change him and turn his life around.
From the time the fire was started to the investigation turning the key, he nods the head at court. What sort of a time frame are we looking at there, Graeme?
From the time the fire was lit to the time we charged him, I think it was within a week. That's a quick turnaround. They were long days, but as I said, the other crime keeps ticking along, but they were long days and a real dedicated team, even though it was a small team. But when those big jobs happen in the country, everyone chips in. Everyone was really on the ball with it. So, we got a lot of quick data and evidence from the fire brigade, from the ambos, what they saw, and the community gets involved. So a really quick turnaround. Well, a week is quite quick. Normally you'd be thinking around that 4 to 6 week mark. But we were lucky we had some pretty overwhelming evidence to get. But then by the time it gets to court, we are talking a few months at least down the track. I think almost a year before he pled guilty.
And custodial sentence as a result of that?
Yeah, I believe he did do, of my memory, I think a minimum maybe 6 to 8 months on non-parole. I think just because of the breach of trust in the community. I guess the planning he'd gone to and trying to throw his partner under the bus did not go in his favour.
Coming up, how a thorough investigation 30 years ago proved the difference in bringing an offender to court. Graeme, 2021, you're involved in the investigation and successful prosecution of an armed robbery which actually took place some 27 years earlier, around 1994. Can you have a chat to us about this case?
Yeah, this is probably one that stands out for me as a career highlight, not just the longevity of the investigation, but how meticulous we had to be and how thorough we had to be throughout the time of it, and I guess the progress of investigative techniques. So 2021 was when we finally got through all the court process and finally one person convicted of the armed robbery in 1994, infamously called Operation Road Gang by Victorian Police. I was actually in the police academy in 1994 when this crime occurred, and I remember sitting in the muster room, or the relaxing room as you might call it, watching the news after a long day at the police academy, and the story comes up on the news around this, armor guard crew that had been robbed of people posing as road workers. So the offenders had posed as road workers in high-vis vests and stop-go signs and stopped the armor guard truck on the entrance to the old Southeastern Freeway, and they'd had a key cut to the back of the truck and handcuffed the guards and robbed them of $2.4 million. And $2.4 million in 1994 is a significant amount of cash. So quite a high-profile armed robbery at the time, and obviously the armed robbery squad back then was called in, and as a junior guy sitting there watching it with my squad mates, I remember at the time saying to them, geez, that's the sort of stuff I'd like to investigate. That's why I want to be a copper. Fast forward to, I think, 2006, so a significant amount of time later, where I end up finding myself at the armed crime squad. Another crime had occurred out at Sunshine Plaza where an armor guard truck had, I think it's about $1.2 million stolen from it at Sunshine Plaza. That wasn't an armed robbery, though. That was an inside job where an armor guard employee was found guilty of leaving the door of the armor guard truck just a little bit ajar, but not enough that anyone would see. And a third party walked up to the truck, opened the door, put a red rag over the camera, the internal camera, and then walked out the back door with $1.2 million and nothing to be seen. So that was the investigation where I came in on in 2006. I remember looking around the room and thinking, this is well planned, this is executed perfectly. It was outside cameras. Whoever pulled this job knows what they're doing. And we're in a bit of a change at the time, infamously, in Victoria Police with the armed robbery squad and some things. So a few of us had come across from different squads and formed a new unit there, and we had fresh eyes, but we didn't know the history of this crew or the armed robbery. And thankfully some people reached out to us and said, geez, that job that got pulled at Sunshine, that sounds like the same guys that we think pulled the AE Road Gang job back in 1994. And we're like, wow, they've popped up again. Really tight crew. We got told the names of who were involved, and I can't say too much there because we've only got one person convicted, but I think the judge at the time of sentencing described this crime as being military style precision, and it's almost something you see in the movies. It was that level of preparation, that level of discipline. So we did a lot of digging. I did a lot of work around in 2006 of what other crimes had these guys been involved in. Surely they hadn't gone from 1994 to 2006 and kept low. We did link through forensics and circumstantial evidence a number of crimes we thought they were involved in, generally around, I think we thought about 8, because we did have a task force start up around Operation Octopus. So we weren't big for naming things back then. We had 8 jobs, so we called it Octopus. It just made it easy. And I think everyone knew what we meant by octopus. And we started looking at this crew, and we did have them linked to those 8 jobs from, the early 90s all the way through to 2006. So again, all of them very well planned, generally had an inside man, was large amounts of cash. I think one target was the Myer building back in the day. Another one was out at Chadstone, and very violent armed robberies. Some had shots fired. Some security guards had been shot. Some had been tied up. We even believe this crew had been involved in a couple of murders of people that were really tight to them that they thought were leaking information out of the group. So they had to be dealt with. So we're talking the highest level of crimes and criminals that we were dealing with. So very aware of our tactics. They were very aware of what police methodology would be. So we weren't coming up with much, but we started to focus on forensics that back in 1994 wasn't a thing. So we retested some of those exhibits. I remember going down to the cages down at the old St Kilda Road Crime Department, and some of the exhibits were, dust, literally blowing the dust off the old boxes from 1994. And as I said, they posed as road workers, so they had the witch's hat set up to steer traffic. And we all know how you pick up a witch's hat is you put your 2 fingers in the top of the hole and you pick it up. I guess back then fingerprints were a big thing, and the way you would handle an exhibit in those days around fingerprints is you wouldn't touch it. So at least we knew that if over time we swabbed these witches' hats and the handcuffs, that we would potentially get some DNA. And we thought we'd either get DNA from the victims, if it was on the handcuffs, or we may get DNA from the police, perhaps, if they were handled or breathed on as they were being bagged. But we might also get DNA of some suspects. Now, what we found is we did those DNA testings, and we did get a result in that we had unmatched DNA that was not the victims, because we had to go back and see the victims, which was quite surreal, 2007 or 8, going back to these victims, from 1994 and knocking on their door in 2008 and saying, hey, we'd like to get a sample of your DNA to run against the handcuffs. It's quite triggering for them as well, because it still lives with them all those years later. And the results were that it was not the victim's DNA. So we had unmatched DNA of offenders, and we believe not the police, because all police had their DNA on the system. So we had a bit of a starting point to go, we need to work on this crew. We need to try and obtain their DNA if we could somehow. It wasn't enough to get a court order, because we really just had a theory or a basis. It was all circumstantial. We eventually, I think in 2007 or 8, we asked the Crime Command for a task force to look at this a lot closer, but unfortunately the appetite of the day was to not do that. And we started to run into some brick walls, hitting hurdles. And as I said, the crew that we're looking at were very disciplined. We looked at new phone records. We looked at all the traditional techniques that you see in the moves, and we just come out with 0. So really disciplined, and unfortunately we had to park it for a while. And a few of us from that time got promoted and moved on. And I remember talking to a mate of mine who's actually now quite senior in the Crime Command at the moment, and said to him, one day someone will ring us about this job, and they'll say, what can you say about Operation Octopus? And I think it was, I'm going to say almost 10 years after that I got a phone call, and I'm up at Wodonga Detectives and doing my thing up there and living the good life in the northeast. And yep, got the phone call from my mate. And he said, hey, Simph, it's reignited again, Operation Octopus. Do you remember, where's this and where's that, and where was the original, paperwork for this, and where do we file it? Yeah, it breathed new life, because a witness had come forward from Sydney. This particular witness had been caught in some serious organised crime in Sydney and was facing a significant term of imprisonment. I think they'd end up codenaming this person Witness T for their own protection. And Witness T told the New South Wales Police the story of Road Gang and the story of this crew, and pretty much everything that we had believed had been committed. This Witness T was telling us in great detail that only someone that close to the crew would know. So the investigation had a heartbeat again, thankfully, and Operation Tideland commenced. A whole team of investigators then started again on this crew with fresh eyes, but this time with an insider that had decided to roll. And I guess it shows over time allegiances change, relationships can break down, and the motivation, I guess, for this particular witness did not want to face a significant jail term for other matters and had a story to tell and a hope to do a deal. And that management of that witness was significant for Victoria Police in that, had this crew become aware that witness T was talking to police, well, we know what they were capable of. We had no doubt whatsoever that witness T would be taken care of. So a lot of risk, the highest risk game you can play with these types of investigations is people's lives. So, the guys and girls down there did an amazing job over many years. And in that, I can't talk to exactly those tactics because, as I mentioned at the start, there's only one conviction out of this job, and we know that there's more people involved. And I hold out hope that some DNA may come forward, or there may be others that may have to stand trial. So I won't go into too much there. But we did end up getting, as I said, the one person convicted. Percy Lanciano was convicted in 2021 after a number of trials and appeals, and he was found guilty of planning that robbery and Operation Road Gang. And not only we'd look at the forensics and DNA, but in this day and age, we chase the money. And right back to, I guess, when investigations start, if you can chase the money, then you generally can find out the who. And the Criminal Proceeds Squad and Victoria Police did an amazing job in tracing the money, and all the money from the robberies, particularly in regards to Mr. Lanciano, went into real estate in Williamstown. And we were able to track that money back to the Armoured Guard job. Strong circumstantial evidence as to his link to that crime.
It's an incredible case, not only the length of time, but all those pieces coming together. This Pasquale Lanciano, he was the one member of the gang that's been locked up. He was 63 years of age, I think, at the time of starting his imprisonment term. So it was his DNA that was on the cuffs. It was identified all those years later?
No, his DNA was not matched, no. It was all the other circumstantial evidence against him, and there were some witnesses that testified he made admissions to it. There was the money, and there was a recorded conversation he had with another person where it's alleged, well, he's been found guilty now, so where there was a conversation of him saying that he just did the planning, even though he didn't pull the job, he did the planning for it. And, I think it shows the level of effort of, the investigators in 94 were at the top of their game, some of the best Victoria Police could offer. And then over the decades, everyone's professionalism, everyone's skills in managing those investigations and the new techniques set us up for success in 2021, that's for sure.
This witness T, Graeme, that came forward with information, was that information, and I think there was some recorded conversations, was that directly linked to Pasquale Lanciano, or was it not directly involving him but possibly others?
Yeah, my recollection was broadly everyone. So this witness T was involved with his crew over many years, many years and many jobs. It wasn't just Operation Road Gang that witness T spoke to police about. The testimony that witness T gave police was so in-depth that only someone involved in that crime would know about it. Some of the details that witness T had never been released to the public, so we knew that this person was really close to the fire.
Graeme, the term cold case is one that, again, our listeners are more familiar with now. I think there's a TV show that might be a couple named of that. I guess you could argue this is what we would describe, perhaps the police themselves may not, but as almost a cold case. Started in 94, reopened around 2006-07. Investigations are done, but you can't just devote a whole team or task force to an investigation endlessly. There's a point where, even with new evidence, if there's not enough, that gets shelved. And then there's that phone call that you get up there in Wodonga around about maybe 2017-18. So that's a cold case in essence, isn't it, from about 2006-07 for the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that's the really important point is that, police command have got to see progress. They're not just going to – it's a lot of money to run a task force and a lot of money and investment to continue an investigation. It's a cold case. So they want to see progress, and rightly so. They want to see you moving forward. You've got to – I guess we would have to detail exactly what the strategy is, what the cost is going to be, how long this is going to take. And I guess they're almost KPIs as to where you're going to take the investigation. And if you're not meeting that, then there's a chance you're going to get shut down or a chance it's going to be shelved. And we did see that. I think I alluded to, I think in 06, we had a crack, and we were just coming up with crickets, and it was time to shut it down because we just didn't have enough to justify the resources being spent. So we did have to shelve it. with the hope that one day something would reignite, and it did. And in Witness T and some other aspects that made that kick off. But I think they had a little bit more to go on the second phase of Operation Tideland, and particularly having a living witness was key. But again, you've got to justify those cold cases. It's just not a matter of let's throw this one on up for grabs. You've really got to come up with a business case and really new leads as to why Command should sign off on these cold cases. And we see it a lot with cold case homicide, and we're seeing a bit more in cold case sex crimes because DNA matches are getting more and more advanced. And I guess the interfamilial DNA now, it used to just come back as a complete match to this is your person, but the testing's so great now that Mike say we don't exactly know what person it is, but it's got to be from this family group. It's got to be someone within this family's DNA that is your offender. So that may be enough to justify, right, let's kick this off again. But it's not just a conversation, it is a real thorough report and thorough business case as to why you want that matter to go up for review and be signed off for, yes, you'll get a cold case task force.
And it's interesting too, isn't it? We go back to, say, the mid-90s. Yeah, look, DNA, it was sort of around, but it was in its sort of embryonic stages, and it wouldn't have been front of mind with investigators. But as you mentioned before, Graeme, those that investigated that original armed rob back in 94 were at the top of their game. And part of that process when you work with people like that is they know that in the future there could be things that they may not be able to detect that can be detected in the future. So it's almost like that the next guys in step on the shoulders of the ones before them, and that's how these cold cases are built, isn't it?
So very true. And look, hopefully that's exactly what happens now as we accelerate now with AI and what's going to happen in that space. Who knows? But you're doing, I think it shows if you trust your processes and your systems in your training, because it is world-class, that it will stand the test of time. And, in this case, credit to Victoria Police that never gave up and eventually got a conviction for, I guess, one of the most infamous armed robberies in Victoria's history with the Operation Road Gang.
Graeme, you gave 27 years of your life to the service to the good people of Victoria, and as we've heard here today, working in the arson squad, armed robbery squad, you've worked sex crimes, you've worked in all sorts of different environments. You must have taken a world of knowledge out of that 27 years, and you also, I'd imagine, taken some passions for other areas that you now find yourself working in. Graeme, what are some of those areas that you're focused on now?
Yeah, I am. I think once I left the policing, that was quite challenging for a number of years around what do you stand for now, and I'm not probably going to be alone in these comments around what's your identity once you leave policing. I'm sure you get that. What I stand for, and I lost a bit of that self-identification around serving the community and what my past was. So I quickly found myself volunteering as one of the directors for the Centre Against Violence up here in the Northeast as part of their board of directors, and really meaningful work on having an impact for our community up here, survivors and victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. So, to have that, I guess, skill set and knowledge over so many years from frontline policing to now put that into a board of directors as to, I guess, that victim side of things, and certainly from the policing side of things, makes a difference on that. And definitely having males in that roles, I'm quite a minority, I think, in that space, particularly with domestic violence and violence against women. So it's really a strong passion of mine now to be someone that stands up for that. And I think we need some more men quietly to stand up, because we see a lot of great movements here that are going really well, but we're probably lacking a little bit more of some men to stand up and go, we won't stand for that, and actually mean it and live it and call it out, call all those behaviours out, because I don't think we do that enough. We don't want to be the one to call it out for fear of retribution of either public or getting it wrong. But generally, in my experience, if your gut's telling you something's not right with a domestic situation, it's not hard to ask a question. How are you going? Are you okay? Are you safe? And the amount of times I've actually had someone either break down or reach out a few weeks later and go, Simph, I'm actually not safe. How do I leave this relationship? We then put him in contact with people either at the Orange Door or the Centre Against Violence, and away they go. And the whole thing there is to make people safer and try and put that line down on domestic violence.
And so very, very important, Graeme, to have male voices in that space, as you rightly say. Graeme, I want to thank you so very much for dropping in and having a chat to us from down there in Victoria. It's given a wonderful insight. Great to have a chat to you again, and thanks for dropping by.
Thanks, Brent. Take care.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original podcast. The production team for this episode was Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Link Kelly. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. I'm Brent Sanders. Thanks for listening.